peace. We strive to educate, to engage, and to empower people in issues of justice and peace, locally and globally, about Israel-Palestine, about U.S. policy, about broader issues in the Middle East, and even beyond. And so we thank you for being here tonight for this really exciting program. We're really excited to have Matt DUSS here, and we'll turn the floor over to him in just a minute. But I don't know where the snow came from for the few minutes there, but I'm glad it stopped. Today, Matt's from Washington, D.C., and I just talked to son Andrew today, and the whole city was closed down today because of the blizzard there. Everything was closed, the government offices, Andrews University, American University, all the schools. It was amazing. So anyway, we're glad it was just a couple of flakes here. Oh yeah, more than maybe a couple of flakes, I guess.
Speak for yourself.
I wouldn't have picked up on that had you not been giggling. Please follow us on Facebook. We're doing much more with Facebook these days, so please follow us on Facebook. Lots of interesting articles and other useful information that's being posted on a regular basis. So please, if you haven't become our friends yet, please befriend us, because we would appreciate that. These were set out on your seats. Please take one of these home with you tonight. It's a very important resource. These are our programs for 2015. We're really excited about our lineup this year. You'll notice that Thursday, March the 26th at Beacon Heights, we're showing the film Girl Rising, an amazing, amazing film. And then just following up on that, on Monday, the following week, and the reason that they're so close together, Monday of the following week is Monday of Holy Week, but we're having Shabana, who is the director of and one of the co-founders of School of Leadership Afghanistan. And our friend Terry Doherty just told me he was on the phone with Shabana this morning, and she'll be speaking, next week?
Clinton Global Initiative next week
Next
in
week
New York.
at the Clinton Global Initiative with Melinda Gates and Hillary Clinton, sharing the stage with them, talking about what she's doing to educate young women in Afghanistan. It's the only boarding school for girls in Afghanistan, and they're doing amazing, amazing, amazing work there. Terry's on the board, and she's also the global ambassador for the Girl Rising Initiative. It's more than just a film, it's a whole initiative for young women around the world. So Girl Rising on Thursday the 26th, Shabana on Monday, March the 30th. Both of those are at Beacon Heights Church of the Brethren. Sunday, May the 3rd, Daoud Nasser, Bethlehem farmer, Tent of Nations. A good friend of ours, Terry and I were on his farm in December. A very compelling story, a microcosm of the issues in Israel and Palestine. Bethlehem, Palestinian, Christian, farmer, on the road between Bethlehem and Hebron. And just last May, while he was on a speaking tour in Seattle, the Israeli military came and overturned 1,500 of his trees. Fruit-bearing trees right at the age and right at the time of bearing fruit. The theme of his environmental farm is "We refuse to be enemies," and he has a very compelling personal story. It will be Daoud's second time in Fort Wayne, and you really want to hear him speak. We're excited about hosting Fort Wayne's first Arab Fest on Saturday evening, June the 6th, and Sunday during the day, June the 7th. Our board chair, Sam Jarger, just informed me last week that we have a camel coming for camel rides. It's kind of a cultural celebration. It's really about the celebration of Arab culture and hospitality. Plenty of Arab food. We've got different folks from the Muslim and Christian Arab community here in Fort Wayne and beyond who are our partners. in this effort. And so we're really excited about Arab Fest. So spread the word far and wide. It's free and open to y'all to come. We're going to have henna. We're going to have music. We've got a Debka group from Toledo. We have a musician coming from Dearborn. We have lots of family-friendly and child-friendly activities and games. It's going to be really exciting. We're going to show a film after dark on Saturday night outdoors so people can come and spread blankets and watch the film. And so it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful event. Arab Fest, June 6th and 7th. And then the last just general announcement I want to make out of here, just highlighting things. Our gala, our annual fundraising gala in September is with retired Archbishop Elia Shakur, our dear Abuna Shakur, who this will be his third visit to Fort Wayne in the last 15 years. Some of you who've traveled with me have sat in his courtyard or inside the school and visited with Abuna in Ibilene. And he's just a dear, dear man. I'm on his national board here in the U.S., Pilgrims of Ibilene, and we'll be together in a couple of weeks in Chicago for our national board meetings. We have his book, by the way, Blood Brothers, for sale back at the table, and we're excited about Abuna coming to Fort Wayne. I'd be remiss if I didn't say thank you to Pastor John Gardner, who's sitting in the back, Pastor Ruth Phillips, and the good people of Plymouth Church, the Peace and Justice Task Force here, as well as just the congregation of Plymouth Church. They're always, my church, so warm and welcoming to us. And so thanks to John and Ruth and the people at Plymouth Church. Finally, you'll see this little flyer over on the table. You can pick up one of these. One of the things that Indiana Center for Middle East Peace has done this year is we've adopted 5 mission partners in Israel and Palestine. We're trying to raise money for each one of them throughout the year. We've set aside certain goals for each one. Everything from arts and culture to medical missions to women's programming to children's programming to conflict resolution. They're all covered by the 5 organizations and individuals here. And so pick up a brochure on your way out about our mission partners. And if nothing else, just you can keep these folks in your prayers and in your thoughts. Or if you're moved to make a contribution, you can do that too. But pick up one of these brochures, Mission Partners, on your way out today. And finally, just as a lead-in to our guest speaker, this year, my gosh, it's just hard to believe, but this year is the 10th anniversary of Indiana Center for Middle East Peace. We've been doing this since 2005. And this summer, this June, I have 21 people going to Israel and Palestine with me on our latest Solidarity Tour. That will make over 220 people that I will have taken with me in the last, this is the 10th tour as well. And it will be over 220 people from this area and beyond that will have traveled with me to Israel and Palestine. And so we're really excited about continuing those sorts of opportunities. In fact, we have 6 people from a Presbyterian church in Tecumseh, Michigan, going along. Their pastor and some people from their mission committee, as well as their sessions. So we're excited about spreading out beyond what we're doing here. We've also been asked to write proposals for Manchester College, Manchester University trip next January, as well as the Political Science Department at University of Nebraska at Kearney. I'm just putting the final touches on a 2-week trip for this class in the Political Science Department there. So we're doing things that are spreading far beyond the borders of Fort Wayne. So we're excited about what the next 10 years are going to look like. And the reason I bring up about 10th anniversary is 10 years ago at First Presbyterian Church, just right across the street, was one of our very first big programs. If not our first big program, we had over 200 people there. And we had Corinne Whitlatch from the Churches for Middle East Peace, but we also had Ambassador Phil Wilcox from Foundation for Middle East Peace. He was the then president of Foundation for Middle East Peace. And so Matt, on the 10th anniversary of our organization, we've invited the new president of Foundation for Middle East Peace, Matt DUSS. And we just, we found out just a few weeks ago that the Foundation for Middle East Peace has accepted a grant proposal, and so we've received now, in our 10th anniversary, our first grant from a foundation. And so we're really thankful to the Foundation for Middle East Peace for awarding us this grant for our programming and for what we do here in Fort Wayne. Matt DUSS comes from the Center for American Progress. He's been the president for Foundation for Middle East Peace less than a year, but if you know anything about this man, he's a working machine. He writes for all kinds of for blogs and for periodicals. He's really probably one of the foremost go-to people in Washington, D.C. For academics and for journalists about things that are happening in Israel and Palestine and beyond. And Matt's a relatively new friend in the last year. And Matt, we're really just excited that you accepted our invitation to come and speak with us. He's going to talk tonight about ISIS, Israel-Palestine, and U.S. foreign policy. And so he's going to talk for just a little bit, he said. He said he'd rather spend most of his time answering your questions. So if you want to start formulating your questions, he's going to talk for a little bit, and then we'll have time for you to have at it. So Matt, without any further ado, please welcome Matt DUSS to Fort Wayne.
Thank you, Mike, and it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. My first time in Fort Wayne, so thank you. And you know, someone who gets to travel internationally quite a bit to the Middle East region, but less inside the United States. I always enjoy coming and engaging with people who are interested in these issues. You know, getting outside the confines of Washington and just speaking with people. And it's always helpful to me to speak and hear what kind of questions you have about how you perceive these issues in this region and U.S. policy in an area that obviously I think is very important for U.S. policy. So just to give a bit of background on myself, I think Mike gave you a little bit, but before coming to the foundation, I was a policy analyst at the Center for American Progress. That's a think tank that was founded in 2003. I was there for 6.5 years. Before that, I was a writer at the American Prospect magazine. So my background is in journalism, but journalism with a policy orientation, and that's an area I still enjoy working in, even though as the president of the foundation, I have other responsibilities as well. So just to kind of give you, sort of summarize ahead of time how I'm going to arrange what I'm going to say. And as Mike said, I'm happy to talk for a little while, but I really would appreciate hearing your questions. So I'll keep my opening remarks to maybe about 10, 15 minutes, if that's okay, and then we can just go to a Q&A, because I'd love to hear what you have to say. So I wanted to chat first just about the speech that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu gave to Congress on Tuesday. That was obviously in the news a lot. And talk about some of the disagreements he had with President Obama's Iran policy and that discussion. Then I wanted to just chat for a moment about the Israeli-Palestinian issue and the efforts at bilateral Israeli-Palestinian negotiations that most recently broke down last year, and how that has contributed to, I think, some of the tensions we've seen in the U.S.-Israel relationship. And then I wanted to address briefly the region more broadly, as Mike said, ISIS obviously being a big issue right now. So those are kind of the three kind of bullet points I wanted to go down, and then we can go to Q&A, and you can tell me why I'm completely wrong, or you can tell me what I forgot to mention. So first on the speech, I think it's clear that the Israeli Prime Minister has serious concerns, as he articulated in front of the Congress, about this deal that the United States is negotiating with Iran and its partners in the P5+1. That's the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany. The goal being to prevent Iran's acquisition of a nuclear weapon, the goal being to put to keep Iran's nuclear program under heavy inspection for at least 10 to 15 years. I think that is the timeline that's being talked about now, to make sure that they don't retain enough enriched uranium. And it's amazing for all of us who've worked on the Iran issue over the past years, how Washington, D.C. is now full of nuclear experts who've had to learn all this stuff about enriched uranium and how centrifuges work and all this stuff. And I'm not calling myself an expert, I'm just saying I know a lot more about how uranium is enriched than I ever thought I would as a part of following these negotiations. So the basic thrust of Netanyahu's speech seemed to be that Iran is an irretrievably hostile actor and that any attempts to bind Iran inside an agreement are foolhardy because they're not going to be bound by such an agreement. They will cheat and they will obtain a nuclear weapon which will radically transform the region, which will further destabilize a region that's already very destabilized, and therefore that the U.S. should pull out of these talks and continue to pressure Iran. And then, according to Netanyahu's argument, Iran will eventually capitulate and agree to a much better deal. You know, I think I'm being fair to what he said. I think the direct quote was, "The alternative to this deal is a much better deal," and he was not much more specific than that. And I think, you know, I was a bit perplexed by the speech just because it seems like he had a had a great opportunity to offer an alternative plan. It didn't seem that he offered much an alternative beyond saying we should pressure them more and then they'll give us what we want. But according to the U.S. and the U.S.'s partners, and I think it really is important to understand that this is not just a disagreement between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama. This is agreement between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the U.S. and its partners in the international community. As I said, the P5+1, the UK, France, Germany, Russia, China, all of whom have differing approaches to Iran, but agree on this one item of Iran's nuclear program, they agree that we don't want Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon for various reasons, but that's one thing that we agree on. Excuse me. So it seems that one of the things that's driving this disagreement goes beyond the nuclear issue, and this is a concern that is shared by many of the Arab states in the region, such as Saudi Arabia, such as Egypt, is that they see Iran expanding its influence in the region. This is something that was facilitated a great deal by the U.S. invasion of Iraq. I think it's very clear right now that the invasion of Iraq, the end of Saddam Hussein's regime, removed a key check on the power and influence of Iran. Iran moved into Iraq very quickly after the United States. The U.S. and Iran were acting in very, very close proximity with each other in Iraq over the years when the U.S. occupied that country. And Iran, in the wake of the Arab Spring, which was very hopeful for the first year and a half, but has since, I think, collapsed in the wake of a counter-revolution by authoritarian powers, although I know many others still hold out hope for those forces to really change that region for the better. But for the time being, it seems that the forces of counter-revolution like Saudi Arabia, like the Gulf powers, like Egypt, are really back to their old game of suppressing any possibility of democratic change. And it's interesting that all of these countries, which are Sunni Arab countries, if I need to go into the Sunni versus Shia distinction, but there's also an Arab, thank you very much. There's also a Persian versus Arab, Sunni Shia being a religious distinction, Persian Arab being an ethnic distinction. So there are lots of different facets to some of the tensions that go on here, historical, religious, cultural. But let's just suffice to say that there is a bit of a Cold War. It's often not cold, but a lot of it is. There's a war for influence going on. Some of these Sunni states and Israel, which have been traditional American allies, are very concerned about what they see in the United States accepting an Iran that has influence, a much greater deal of influence than it has had in the past. So I think I'm just trying to give, describe what is driving Netanyahu's opposition to the deal. But as I said, I think he really failed to offer a viable alternative. I think the evidence shows in the behavior of the Congress that many in the Congress agree with that. Republican senators tried to fast track a measure that would have given the Congress an overview or the ability to stop a deal and add all kinds of conditions to it. And immediately when they tried to do that, many Democratic senators, including very hawkish senators, including one, Robert Menendez of New Jersey, who had his name on the bill as a co-sponsor, protested at them doing that. So I think if conservatives in Congress hope to capitalize on Netanyahu's speech to move their agenda forward, I think for the time being that has failed, but things can change pretty quickly. So Iran is just one issue on which there has been some tension between the U.S. and Israeli governments over the past year. Another has been efforts to get the Israelis and Palestinians to a two-state agreement. This is something, along with Iran, that President Obama described as his two main agenda items in the Middle East 2 years ago at the United Nations. President Obama has indicated since taking office and even before that he sees the Israeli-Palestinian issue as one of the key conflicts in the region, not the worst, not the most important, but one of a number of key conflicts, and one in which the United States is particularly invested and implicated, obviously by virtue of being Israel's closest ally. We give Israel a great deal of military support, political support in multilateral organizations like the UN, and we're close allies just at a people-to-people level. So that's one of the reasons that Obama has been invested in this. However, Netanyahu has kind of a different view on how things should work with the Palestinians. Even though he voiced support for a Palestinian state upon taking office in 2009 when he was reelected, I think his behavior since then has really called that commitment into question. And starting last summer during the Gaza war, he even announced that the Gaza war demonstrated that Israel simply could not withdraw from the West Bank, which, for me is kind of, well, all right, that's pretty much the game. If you're going to say that Israel cannot withdraw from the West Bank, it's very, very hard to see how anything resembling what we might call an actual state for the Palestinians could come into being. And I'd be happy to talk more about that. So, we've got the Iran issue and the Palestinian issue, which are two key points of tension. Let's put this in a broader regional context. You have ISIS, which was formed, the core of ISIS, let's understand, was what we once called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. This was an organization that was founded in Iraq during the U.S. occupation. It had a relationship with what we might call core Al-Qaeda in the Pakistan-Afghanistan area. They were led by a man named Zarqawi. Some of you might recognize that name, who was killed in, I think it was 2007 when he was finally killed. But what they had, and which Al-Qaeda didn't have, was just this idea of creating a caliphate, an actual Islamic state. And at one point, I think it was 2005 or 2006, they actually declared the creation of an Islamic State in Iraq. That was something that members of the leaders of core Al-Qaeda did not really appreciate for reasons I'll explain. Once you declare that you are now a state and you declare a sense of your own historical inevitability, which is something that drives ISIS, just this sense that they are historical actors, God is on their side, and they've established this Islamic State, and now they can only grow and expand into all of the region. If we get down a few years from now and they haven't expanded, if they haven't made good on these claims, then that really tends to discredit those claims in the eyes of the people they're trying to appeal to. We saw this dynamic played out with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is why they received a lot of criticism from the other Al-Qaeda leaders. They were saying, well, if you fail, you're kind of undermining your case, and that's precisely what happened. This organization was defeated or diminished, not fully defeated as we saw, diminished to a great deal. But they were able to exploit the instability that came in the wake of the Arab Spring, particularly in Syria, where you had uprisings that were at first nonviolent. The Syrian President Bashar al-Assad cracked down on them quite viciously. Those that became an insurgency and now became a full-blown civil war. And different militant groups are able to exploit that instability. And we saw the growth of a number of very extreme insurgent groups, including now ISIS, who has become probably the most notable and the biggest and the most vicious of these groups. So, as to how you solve a problem like ISIS, not to quote Sound of Music, but how do you, at some point, it's going to take people in the region themselves to deal with these problems. That's not to say the United States can't play a role. Certainly we can. But I just want to go back to, and perhaps maybe surprising to you, and I'm not really, I'm not someone who agreed with the George W. Bush administration on a great deal, but one thing that I did agree with them on is that in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration offered an analysis of the region that said, one of the drivers of this extremism is the fact that this region is full of governments that are seen as illegitimate, unaccountable. They don't serve the needs of their people. They're undemocratic. Their people don't have freedom. They don't have opportunities. And the fact that the United States has supported so many of these regimes in the name of stability, in the name of cheap oil or what have you, this has blown back on the United States. This is one of the reasons that these people are angry at the United States, because they see us quite reasonably as a key benefactor of their oppressors. Now, George Bush took that analysis and used it to frame what he called the freedom agenda, supporting that the U.S. should support democracy in the Middle East. That turned out to be a lot more difficult than he seemed to think or understand initially. But still, my view is it's the right analysis. I don't think his diagnosis was the right one. I think it's important to understand that is one of the things that's driving it. It's not the only issue. I think you have the kind of core of these extremist groups who are very ideological, but their appeal, the reason that this ideological appeal gets to some of these young men, what causes some of these young men to travel great distances to join up with these groups, is because they find themselves living under regimes that they just do not see as legitimate. So I think the longer term challenge is to try to facilitate and encourage in various ways, and this may not be just a government thing, this is a civil society, this is a people-to-people thing. This is the role of people like myself and groups like ours that support progressive values, that support democracy and freedom, to identify our colleagues in these countries and help them to change their own societies. But I think it's important for the leaders of the United States to articulate that, and that's a criticism I have a little bit of the Obama administration, because I think he could have been, or he can be, a bit more vocal about that than he has been. So maybe I'll just pause there if we have any questions about what I've said so far, and I can take off a bit more if you want me to do that. But sir.
In this morning's paper, there was an editorial from the Washington Post, and the editorial basically said that the Obama administration hasn't really taken seriously enough what Netanyahu had said is a threat to Israel. Would you agree that the Obama administration hasn't taken it seriously enough or articulated the serious nature sufficiently?
I would not agree with that at all. I think and I know because I hear this regularly from Israeli officials who I speak to, they've said this publicly, that the consultations between the U.S. and Israel, specifically on a whole range of issues, but specifically on the issue of Iran, are better than they've ever been. The United States takes Israel's concerns on Iran extremely seriously. We take Israel's security. The United States government takes Israel's security extremely seriously, but particularly on the question of Iran. And I think you can find Israeli leaders, including today, I just saw a report in the Times of Israel with the Meir Dagan, the former head of the Israeli Mossad, which is basically their CIA, who made it his mission to deal with the Iranian nuclear program, who was strongly criticizing Netanyahu's speech, not only on its substance or lack of substance, but on the way it was carried out and the way it potentially endangers the most important strategic relationship that Israel has, which is, of course, with the United States.
A quick comment on your kind of last point with the Arabs looking at the governments as illegitimate. I agree 100%, having grown up in an Arab country. But I want to add two things. One, when we talk ideologically, also Islamically speaking, in the Quran says that God will not change the situation of the people unless they change within themselves. So that's a Quranic teaching that unfortunately doesn't get as much attention as other parts that people use to radicalize youth and whatever. But besides the viewing the government as illegitimate, it's actually the repercussions of having an illegitimate government from there's no hope, economically depressed, a lot of geographical, socioeconomic issues that push people into kind of desperate measures and then preyed upon by people that claim to know the Quran or the religion and creating that. So I was wondering if you come across that in your analyses as you see it. I mean, this is from someone who's lived in that situation point of view.
No, yeah, I completely agree. I think and I'm not the first person to say this, but I think there are some similarities if you look what drives people to join gangs. If you look what caused, guys in the antebellum South to join the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, it's not that necessarily they were uneducated. In some cases they were. It's not necessarily that they were poor, although in some cases they were. It's that these groups offer them meaning. And I think that's a key thing to understand. Oftentimes they feel like they're not in a situation where they have control over their lives. They don't seem to feel like they have much of a future. And again, this is one of several factors, but I think it's a very key one, is that these groups, ISIS in particular, offers them a chance to become actors in history, a destiny, the chance to change history and make history. And that's very, very powerful. Yeah.
I wanted to go back a couple of years when the war in Syria started, and there was a lot of confusing discussion about whether the United States should do something, and if we should do something what, or if we should keep our hands off, and you know, it's an internal civil war, and we were just trying to get away from Iraq and Afghanistan and withdraw, and we were stretched thin, blah, blah, blah. Looking back, would it have been possible, just give us your opinion, I mean, 20/20 hindsight now, but it was still very confusing to me as to what, if anything, we might have been able to do to stop from exacerbating the situation.
No, I think
Matt, since we don't have a microphone out here, would you summarize
Sure,
the
no
question
problem.
briefly?
The question was, looking back at the way the Syria civil war has played out, would it have been wiser for the United States, if I understand, to try to intervene earlier on to support some of the democratic forces in, you know, the opposition? And I think the key word there you said is hindsight. I think, you know, given how things have turned out, I think it's very tempting to think, okay, we could have intervened, we could have supported some of these forces who were secular and democratic, or even intervened in a stronger way through economic pressure. Even though economic pressure was applied, but earlier on when it was still relatively nonviolent. But I think the analysis then, and I think it makes sense, is once you start to intervene, once you become involved, it's very hard to extract yourself. And I think, and now it's very, very possible that the Obama administration and the American foreign policy establishment more broadly has sort of overinterpreted the lessons of Iraq. But that's what tends to happen. The experience of Iraq was we found ourselves bogged down in this conflict that at the end of the day we found very hard to understand. There were forces at work that we clearly were not prepared for. There was an enormous cost for the U.S. in lives and money. There was certainly an enormous cost for the Iraqis, over 100,000 killed, many times that named, absolutely transformed their society, destroyed it, I think, in many ways. So I think Obama sees himself as someone who was elected, I think this is quite reasonable, he sees himself as someone who was elected on the kind of wave of opposition to the Iraq war. And he's very, very cautious about getting America into something like that again. So I think one can argue that he has been overcautious. I think that's probably fair, but again, I haven't really seen anyone offer kind of a strategy that if we had done this, then this would happen. Because once you're involved in someone else's war, there's just, it's the nature of it. I mean, it's a monster. You know, you cannot predict where it's going to go. Sir?
One of the foundations of the Obama administration's policy on Iran is that we will not permit the Iranians to have a nuclear weapon.